Good morning. You're not tired of me yet? No, that's good. We'll see after today. I apologize to Alfred and to those of you who are organizing the service. The roads were a bit rough and I didn't anticipate that I would have as much trouble as I did, but I made it here, so. A couple of weeks ago I talked about the book of Proverbs, and Neil Wiebe came and spoke on Ecclesiastes, and so today I want to finish it up by talking about the book of Job. And why these three books? It's because they're considered part of the Bible's wisdom literature. And why are they considered part of the Bible's wisdom literature? Is they both share these verses, or they all three of them share these verses. And Job chapter 28, verse 28 says, God said to man, "Behold, the fear of the Lord, that is wisdom, and to turn away from evil is understanding." And if you guys remember from a couple of weeks ago, Proverbs 9, verse 10 says, "The fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom, and the knowledge of the Holy One is insight." And Ecclesiastes, at the end of Ecclesiastes, we see this. "This is the end of the matter, all has been heard. Fear God and keep his commandments, for this is the whole duty of man." And so, when we want to know what's wise in this world, and the world has all sorts of ideas of what's wise, but the Bible in these three books gives us its idea of what's wise, and it clashes sometimes with what the world says. And so we're going to dig into the book of Job and to see what it says about wisdom. And one of the big themes about Job is, can God be trusted to run the universe? It's a big book, 42 chapters, and it's hard to preach all of that in one sitting. So what I want to do today is, it'll be more like giving you guys tools for when you read the book of Job, giving you an ability to look at it in a new light maybe, or to understand it a little bit better. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to give you the structure of Job, just the kind of how it all flows, and then I'll give you some frequently asked questions. Questions that I've heard many times from either pastors or people that I've read on the book of Job, questions that they all ask, and hopefully that'll give us some insight into the book. And so most of us, I think, are probably somewhat familiar with the story. What starts off in chapters 1 and 2, we get this setting where there's a shift between what's happening on earth and what's happening in heaven. And there's kind of this idea of the guys on earth don't know what's happening in heaven. Some of you, especially if you have kids, you've probably seen the movie Finding Nemo. And one of the things is the father who lost his son in that movie is looking for his son and looking for his son. And the son is looking for the father and looking for the father, and they end up passing each other. The father goes to where the son was, and the son's not there, and the son goes to where he thinks the father is, and the father's not there, and they do eventually find each other, but it's a lot of, we have different ideas of how we're going to fix this problem, and they keep passing each other. And this kind of is what the first two chapters feels like. Things are happening in heaven, and things are happening on earth, and throughout the whole book we need to keep that in mind, is Job doesn't actually know, and Job's friends don't actually know what's happening. God has a reason for why he's allowing this to happen. And so we have the characters. There's Job. He's a righteous man. We get introduced to him. And he's not just a righteous man. He's a priest for his family, which means he offers sacrifices for his family. He cares for them spiritually. He makes sure that they are on the right path before God. He's also not an Israelite. In fact, there's only one person who is an Israelite, and it's not Job or his three friends. It's somebody else. But none of these people that we get introduced to in the beginning are Israelites. They're in the land of Uz, and that's not an Israelite country, and their names are not Israelite names. And then, so that's what's happening on earth. We get introduced to Job, but then we swing on over into heaven, and God is holding court in heaven. It says the sons of God are coming before God, and so God, it's sort of like God is the king, and these different officers, officials, the angels, are coming before God and telling them about their business and what they've been doing. And God expresses in this passage a proudness or even a fondness of Job. He actually praises Job twice. He praises him first, and he says, "Have you considered my servant Job?" And then again, later on, he doubles down on his praise, and he says, "Have you considered my servant Job, who is still righteous, even though you tried to destroy him?" And there seems to be this hesitation to harm Job. And the one who's actually looking to harm Job is a person that we're told in Scripture is called Satan. And we all know, we've all heard the name before, but Satan isn't an English word. It's actually a Hebrew word that they just left untranslated. And in Hebrew, the word Satan means accuser, a prosecutor, somebody who is against you in the court, somebody who is looking to work your downfall, see about your downfall. And he comes before God's presence, and he does two things. He subtly, he kind of kills two birds with one stone. He's attacking Job's character, and he's attacking God's policy of generally God blesses the righteous and punishes the wicked. And so he asked the question, why is Job righteous? Isn't it because you bless him? Or because he wants to avoid punishment? Is it because he loves you? No. Satan says it's not because he loves you, it's because you bless him. And so that sets off the chain of events that leads to Job's demise. And of course, we're familiar with Job's famous words, the Lord gives and the Lord takes away. He loses all his possessions, his family, or his kids. Strangely, Satan leaves his wife. That's maybe a little bit of humor there. And she tells him, you should just curse God and die. And he says, should we accept good from God and not also accept bad? And I think for most of us, we'd probably be comfortable actually if it ended here. If the book of Job ended here, 2 chapters long. Why? And I think because you could make the case that God's trust has been vindicated. And those of us who haven't suffered can easily say at the end of chapter 2, some people suffer for God. Some people suffer on God's behalf, and that's their job. And maybe we shouldn't stop here. Maybe we should jump right to chapter 42, where Job is vindicated and he gets all of his stuff back and more. And so for those of us who have suffered in life, maybe unjustly, we say, yes, there's a reward. But the book doesn't permit us to just jump right to chapter 42. There's a ton of chapters in between. And chapter 2 itself ends with the arrival of Job's 3 friends, Eliphaz, Bildad, and Zophar. If they sound like sneezes, to you they sound like sneezes to me, but they're actually names, and they're actually listed in order of the speeches that they give. So Eliphaz will speak first, then Bildad, and then Zophar. And so the beginning of Job is quite easy to understand. Maybe we don't understand why God allows it, but it sort of has a good ending. God claimed that Job wouldn't reject him, and he didn't. Unfortunately, chapter 3 says, then Job opened his mouth. And isn't that the start of all trouble? I remember when I was a little bit younger, not much younger than I am now, I had this dream of getting really in shape. So I went and bought a gym membership. And I guess somewhere in my mind I thought, just the act of buying a gym membership would already do the trick. I wanted to jump to the end where, I was nice and fit. I found it really hard to actually go and do the middle part, which is the hard part and which takes the longest and hurts the most. And that's actually doing the heavy lifting. And so that's what we're going to do now here with Job's conversation with his friends. And so what I just want to do is I want to do a quick flyover. So Job has 3 friends, and there are 3 cycles of conversation. And this is how these 3 cycles of conversation go. And each cycle, Job's going to speak. He's going to say something. He's going to complain about something. He's going to question God's wisdom. He's going to do something that his friends don't like. And then, so in this first cycle, Eliphaz then responds to Job. Well, and then Job responds to Eliphaz. And then Bildad says, oh, I don't like that. And he responds to Job. And then Job responds to Bildad. And then Zophar says, I don't like that. And he responds to Job. And then finally Job responds. And that's one cycle. It goes through all of his friends in a conversation. But there are 3 of those cycles. And so for the first cycle, we see in chapter 3, Job curses the day of his birth. And then in chapters 4 through 5, Eliphaz suggests that there are some reasons why we suffer. And in chapters 6 through 7, Job says, well, okay, yeah, but I need to justify my rash words. And then he also confronts God. He's like, why are you letting me suffer like this? And then chapter 8, Bildad comes in and he says, God is always just, so just ask for mercy. And chapter 9 through 10, Job imagines going to court with God. Imagine, if you will, going to court with the highest authority in the land, how hard that would be for for people like us. We don't have the resources, we don't have the time, but Job imagines it. And Zophar in chapter 11, he responds, he says, Job, you're already on trial. You're already being judged, it's obvious. What's happened to you is already the trial. And so in chapters 12 through 13, Job says, if this is the trial, then I have questions about God's wisdom and God's justice. And yet Job expresses in chapter 13 a hope of meeting up with God and actually having this trial, having it out with God. And that's the first cycle. And then we reset in chapter 14. Job expresses that he's losing hope, but he says maybe it's possible that there's a resurrection and that I can take care of this after the resurrection. Maybe we can set things right after a resurrection. But that kicks off a whole new cycle, chapters 14 through 21, and the friends respond in the exact same order, except with increased irritation. Each speech begins with some sarcastic barbs. Job, attacking his friends a little bit, and then his friends responding. And cycle 3, it gets even more angry. Eliphaz doesn't even bother attacking, being sarcastic, and he just outright calls Job a sinner. And Bildad, he's maybe the level-headed friend of the group, and he tries to restore calm, but Job interrupts him in chapter 26. And Job doesn't even let Zophar speak. Instead, he speaks in Zophar's place in sort of a mocking tone. I know what you're going to say. This is what you're going to say. And so you can see at this point, communication between the friends is broken down, and this is where their conversation with each other ends. They've gotten mad at each other. And so this is the first half of the book of Job. And the last half will actually, Job is going to get his wish. He's asked for a court date with God. And so Job is going to get his wish. He's going to get his court date with God. But in between the last half and the first half, there's a little interlude. And it's a poem about wisdom. And it says, humans will go to all sorts of lengths to find the most precious things, like jewels, like gold. We'll dig in the most remote and hardest to find places for something that we want. But he asks, where can we find wisdom? The thing that we really need, more than jewels. He says, wisdom, it cannot be purchased with the most valuable things that humans find. So where do we find it? Where can we get it? And this interlude ends with it saying, only God knows the path to wisdom. Only God knows where wisdom is hidden. And we get this verse that we mentioned before. God saying to man, behold, the fear of the Lord, that is wisdom. To turn away from evil is understanding. And so, if we're going to find the answer to Job's dilemma, we have to wait for God to speak. And thankfully, in the next section, God speaks. So like I said, the next section is the long-awaited court case between Job and God. And Job goes first. He makes the case for his innocence. In chapter 29, he begins laying out his situation prior to all these disasters that have befallen him. In chapter 29, an insurance adjuster. If you make an insurance claim, the insurance adjuster wants to know, well, what did you all have? You have to insure everything. You can't, if your house burns down, you can't say, ooh, I had, $5 million worth of jewels in there. You can't say that. You have to claim it beforehand. So Job says, listen, this is the status of my life before this disaster happened. And in chapter 30, he details the disaster that happens, and in the very middle of the chapter, he points the finger at God. Chapter 30, verses 19 through 21. God has cast me into the mud, and I have become like dust and ashes, useless. I cry to you for help, and you do not answer me. I stand, and you only look at me. You have turned cruel to me, and with the might of your hand, you persecute me. And then in chapter 31, he highlights his own innocence. He swears oaths of innocence. I know I grew up for the first few years of my life in the States, and I don't know how it is out here. I've never been in court out here. But whenever you go in court in the States, you have to put your hand on the Bible and you swear. And do you swear to tell nothing but the truth and only the truth, so help you God? And there's this sort of the same thing going on here with Job. Is he lists some bad things that he could have potentially done. And then he says, I never did those things. And he says, if I did, let this happen to me. And then he lists another bad thing that he could have potentially done. But he said, I never did it. And he says, if I did, then let these bad things happen. And he's swearing oaths with the implication is if I'm lying, let it happen to me. Let these bad things happen to me. But the point is, I didn't do anything deserving what I've gotten. So after Job finishes speaking, you would expect, well, okay, now it's God's turn. But we get an interruption again. A mystery man shows up. I call him God's herald. If God is as exalted as Job and his friends have said, then he gets to have somebody who comes before him. Like in the Knight's Tale, somebody who announces the name of the knight that's about to fight. And so this man named Elihu, and Elihu means in Hebrew, he is my God. And he gets 6 chapters uninterrupted. He does offer Job the chance to say, hey, do you have anything to say to me? And Job doesn't say anything, so he keeps going. He's not found among Job's friends who traveled to see him in the beginning, and he's not among the friends that God rebukes in the end. He sort of just shows up and disappears. And he does three things while he's talking. He confronts the weakness of Job's friends' arguments and Job's arguments. And he offers some reasons why God may allow suffering to innocent people. He offers some reasons why God is not responding to Job. And then in chapters 36 through 37, he introduces God. We get this picture of there's a storm cloud brewing on the horizon where Job and his now 4 friends are talking. And Elihu starts pointing at the storm cloud and he says, look, here comes God. And so then God does come, chapter 38 through 41. And like in other places in the Bible, God shows up in a thunderstorm, in a whirlwind. And in chapters 38 through 39, God takes Job on a tour of creation, from the stars all the way in the highest down to the desert animals. And he asks him, do you know how to run any of these things? Can you feed the animals? Do you know how to take care of all of the animals? Can you make sure that the stars are in their places? And then God pauses for a reply, much like Elihu does in the middle of his speech. He pauses for a reply, says, Job, do you have anything to say? You've been so keen to get your court case, I want to allow you a chance to speak too. Job says, no thanks. And God ends the description, ends his speech with a description of two huge beasts. One called Behemoth and one called Leviathan. And the point is that no man can contain these beasts. Only God can. And so for the final resolution, or finally a resolution, we get to chapter 42. And chapter 42 begins with Job repenting. He says, he finally has some closure, and it's not through hearing God, he says, but through seeing God. He says, I had heard of you, but now my eyes see you. He's experiencing God. And God doesn't just say, okay, that's good, you're good to go. God has some unfinished business, and so he tells Job's friends, Eliphaz, Bildad, and Zophar, to ask Job to serve as their priest. Why do they need Job as their priest? Because they said wrong things about God. And God also says, Job said what was right about me. And so Job prays for his friends. He offers sacrifices like the priests of the Old Testament do. He prays for his friends. And after he does that, God restores his wealth. And we can say, all's well that ends well. Is that a fair synopsis of the book of Job? Does that match what you've read before? I think when we're frustrated by something, typically what we do is we either ignore it or we simplify it. If something gets under our skin, challenges the way that we normally go about our business, we ignore it or we simplify it. And so when we ignore things, is there a value in ignoring things? And I think if any of you leave before I do, you'll see an old Ford truck sitting out there, and that's what I came in. And I'll tell you, the only thing that works on that truck is the steering wheel, the transmission, and the motor. Nothing else works on that truck. Yes, I don't have any heat. I don't have any AC anymore. I don't have power to a lot of my electrical appliances in my truck. And I just choose to ignore it because I can get along just fine without it. And maybe that's how some of us feel, and I cannot really blame you. I can get along in my Christianity without the book of Job. And I would say, fair enough. It's not the end-all be-all. But I would say, be careful that you don't deny its value. And on really cold days, I think about, hey, maybe I should take my truck and go get the heater fixed. When we suffer unjustly, it's a good time to turn to the book of Job. Sometimes, if we don't ignore things, we simplify them. Like I said in the beginning, we pay attention to the beginning and the end. I remember watching, I forget what my wife was watching, but I sat down, as I do sometimes, and I watched with her, and it was these ladies arguing about a book club, and this lady said, I feel like nothing. You attend a book club, you're so fancy. And the lady says, well, honestly, all I do is I read the first chapter and the last chapter, and then I pretend like I know everything about the book. We like to simplify, right? And again, is this wrong? It seems like that's what James does when he talks about Job. James 5:11, he says, behold, we consider those blessed who remained steadfast. You have heard the steadfastness of Job, and you have seen the purpose of the Lord, how the Lord is compassionate and merciful. And when I look at this reference in James in my reference Bible, a Bible that connects some verses in the Bible to others, the places it references me to is the beginning of Job and the end of Job. And so even the people who made the helps in my reference Bible sort of summarize it. And I think as a summary, that's not a bad thing. To see that Job did suffer and God did see him through it, that is a very valid point of the book of Job. But for any of you who have suffered something terrible, something beyond, and you know that it wasn't you who caused it, suffering isn't simple. Suffering isn't a summary. And Job demonstrates this very well. So, what are some frequently asked questions about the book of Job? And the purpose of asking these questions, I don't want to throw doubt on the value of the book of Job. What I do is want to answer these questions the best that I am able to. And if you've heard any of these questions, my point is that if you've had any of these questions before, my point is that I would like you, in light of my answers, to open the book and read it again. And if you haven't had these questions, hopefully my answers will inspire you to open the book and read it again. And find the humor that's there, the sarcasm between Job and his friends, to struggle with Job and how to find hope in hopeless situations. And even to question Job's integrity with his friends. Job, are you really as righteous as you think you are? And do you have trouble understanding? Well, that's a good understanding of trouble. And you're not alone in struggling to understand this. So one of the first questions that I've heard pastors from our conference, as we've talked together about the book of Job, ask this question: were Job's friends really wrong in what they said? And what we find when we look at Job's friends' words is we find that they do line up with a lot of what Scripture says, or it seems like they do. Proverbs 22 verse 8 says, "Whoever sows injustice will reap calamity, and the rod of his fury will fail." Job 4:8, this is Eliphaz speaking. He says, "As I have seen it, those who plow iniquity and sow trouble reap the same." Even Paul quotes Eliphaz in 1 Corinthians 3:19. He says, "For the wisdom of this world is folly with God. For as it is written, he catches the wise in their craftiness." And Eliphaz says much of the same thing in Job chapter 5. Verse 13, he says, "He catches the wise in their own craftiness, and the schemes of the wily are brought to a quick end." This is Eliphaz's description of God. And I think I want to highlight that both of these quotes are from Job's friend Eliphaz, and both of them come from chapters 4 and 5. Eliphaz is the first to speak in the book of Job of Job's friends. He's also the first to get rebuked by God at the end. Job 42:7 says this, "After the Lord had spoken these words to Job, the Lord said to Eliphaz the Temanite, 'My anger burns against you and against your two friends, for you have not spoken of me what is right, as my servant Job has.'" And so we see that Proverbs says those who sow injustice, the rod of their fury will fail. And we know that the friends, they believe that Job sinned and was wrong, and they were wrong about it. And the rod of their fury did fail. They ended up having to go back to Job. And Paul, when he's quoting, he's actually showing the danger of considering oneself wise in the ways of this age. And actually, as you read through the book of Job, the friends often say, "Hey, listen, we know some things. We're pretty wise in the ways of this age." And so Job's friends are actually relating the wisdom of their age, and the shortcomings of such wisdom prompt God to rebuke them. And so what is so wrong about what Job's friends are saying? What was the wisdom of their day? And like I said, Eliphaz sort of serves as the spokesman for the group. And so if you want to see what they're saying, actually all of their arguments can be found in Eliphaz's argument. To a greater or lesser degree, they all sort of repeat the same arguments that Eliphaz makes in the beginning. And this is a point that Elihu says, you guys have been saying the same thing over and over for all these chapters. But here is the idea that Eliphaz presents and is repeated by his friends. And it's about a view on God's interaction with humans. And it's called something that people who are much smarter than me and study nonstop, they say just retribution theology or retribution theology. And when we hear the word retribution, we probably often think, well, Batman, right? You did something bad and now something bad's coming. The word retribution has kind of taken on a bad sense in our day, but retribution just means you're getting paid out for what you're owed. So if it's good things, you're going to receive good things. And if it's bad things, you're going to receive bad things. And this is what Eliphaz says to Job in chapter 4. Remember, who has ever been innocent and then perished? Or where were the upright ever cut off? As I have seen it, those who plow iniquity and sow trouble reap the same. By the breath of God they perish, and by the blast of his anger they are consumed. And Eliphaz and his friends, they're going to use this to hint. At first they'll hint, and then later on they're just going to plainly say, you're suffering, Job, and so it's obvious that you're guilty. And the problem is that we know that Job is innocent. We've read the first 2 chapters, and Job and his friends haven't. And Job will actually make the case in chapter 21, I think we know this as people as well. Good people sometimes suffer, and sometimes evil people prosper. And that makes us uncomfortable. Because what that means is that God allows unjust suffering. But we find this idea that God allows suffering that isn't necessarily deserved throughout the scriptures. John chapter 9, and we also find this idea that God always rewards good behavior with good and bad behavior with bad, also in the rest of the Bible. John chapter 9, verses 1 through 3, some of us were probably very familiar with this story. As he passed by, he saw a man blind from birth. That's Jesus. And his disciples asked him, Rabbi, who sinned, this man or his parents, that he was born blind? And Jesus answered, it was not that this man sinned or his parents, but that the works of God might be displayed in him. And the Pharisees, they affirm this idea that the disciples have. This blind man, he's being questioned. Who healed you? Who healed you? Tell us who healed you. And the Pharisees are jealous, and among other things. And so in John, at the end of John chapter 9, they get frustrated with him because he says, are you wanting to become his disciples? You keep asking me, and I keep telling you the same answer. And they answered him, and they said, you were born in utter sin. Would you teach us? And they cast him out. So they believed what the disciples believed. This man was blind because he had sinned. He was born in sin. And I think if we're honest, we see this kind of mentality still alive in our own day. And it's uncomfortable to say, but especially among the successful and self-made. And that's, honestly, when we live in the top 10 or even 1% of the world, we're basically all of that. We're all that. Why is it that we feel like this is the way it should be? And I think the reason is because it's terrifying to think that it could just be taken away at a moment's notice. And so instead we say that's what happens to other people who are less careful than I am. And then Job actually says, this is actually what his friends are doing. He tells them this. He says in Job chapter 12, he says, "In the thought of one who is at ease, there is a contempt for misfortune. Rather, it's ready for those whose feet slip." He says, you guys think, because disaster hasn't befallen you, you think, oh, okay, misfortune isn't my lot, it's for the people who sin. And I think there's a fear here in Job's friends that if somebody like Job, whom they realize he seemed righteous, if somebody like Job can lose everything, then I can lose everything as well. And to protect ourselves from that terrifying thought, they say, it must be his fault. It must be his fault. I think one of the reasons that we find it so hard to look at what they're saying and see the problem with it is we know what the rest of the Bible says, just like we know what God is doing in heaven. We've realized that there's a judgment day after we die, and that in light of that, what Job's friends say is very true. And even Job kind of suggests, hey, what if I rise from the dead? In chapters 14 and 13 through 15, he says, what if there was a judgment after I rise from the dead? Maybe I have to die first before I get my court case with God. But his friends, they had no such knowledge, no such concept. And our knowledge of a judgment day, I think, creates this illusion for us that they are right. But I think it still remains, the fact remains, whether in their days or in Christ's day or in ours, when we see somebody who's wealthy and they're healthy, that means God approves of them. And so then their inverse must also be true. Somebody who's suffering, what did they do wrong? How did they earn this suffering? And I think both the book of Job and Jesus make it very clear that that's actually not the full picture. That's not the right way of looking at things. Another question people have asked, was Job right? Was Job really right in what he said? At the end of chapter 2, we read the story of Job and we're kind of rooting for him. He's like, okay, he suffered and he stayed true. But if we keep reading on till chapter 27, where the conversation with his friends ends, maybe our enthusiasm for Job and his perspective probably dampens. All of chapter 21, Job says, God ignores the wicked. It seems like God just lets wickedness go and do what it wants. In chapter 9, 22 through 24, he says this, it's all one, it's all the same. Therefore I say, God destroys both the blameless and the wicked. When disaster brings sudden death, he mocks at the calamity of the innocent. The earth is given into the hand of the wicked, and he covers the faces of its judges. If it isn't him, then who is doing it? And this kind of statement causes us discomfort with Job. It causes discomfort among those who fear God. And it causes boldness among those who don't fear God, among the godless. Eliphaz actually notices this, and he says to Job in chapter 15, verse 4, you are doing away with the fear of God and hindering meditation before God. And Elihu actually notices this as well. He says in chapter 34, what man is like Job, who drinks up scoffing like water, who travels in the company with evildoers and walks with wicked men? For he says, it profits man nothing that he should take delight in God. And so Job, first timidly, and then as he goes on, he boldly begins demanding a day in court with God. And God answers his demand. And this is uncomfortable. We're uncomfortable with the words of Job, and then so we're equally uncomfortable with the fact that God says in chapter 42, verse 7, "You guys haven't said what's right about me like my servant Job has." What did Job say about God that was right? And I want us to recall the friends' arguments. Their arguments goes something like this: God always punishes the wicked and always rewards the righteous. In this life, that's how God operates. Therefore, Job must have been wicked. And Job says, "I haven't, so your picture of God is too simple." God obviously has a policy beyond just giving us exactly as our actions deserve immediately. And Job says in chapter 13, he says, "Are you guys defending God? No, you're defending yourselves." He realizes that there's a fear that if what happened to Job is true, then it can happen to them too. And so, and I think we want it to be true at sometimes too. We would like for there to be a way to control God. And Job, instead, he says, "I want to meet God even if it kills me. Though he slay me, yet I will trust in him." He wants to meet God so he can understand why. And the solution is God does meet with him. And Job is very convinced that God himself must be the solution. And it causes Job to do something that nobody in the Old Testament has really done before, and that's anticipate a resurrection. And we've talked about it a little bit in chapter 14, but in chapter 19, he says, "I know that my Redeemer lives, and at the last he will stand on the earth. And after my skin has been destroyed, yet in my flesh I will see God, whom I shall see for myself, and my eyes behold, and not another. And this thought makes me faint." So Job's friends say about God, God is someone who needs to be dealt with carefully for our own benefit. And Job says, God is the only one with the answers that I need. And so he does what Hebrews 4:16 tells us to do. "Then let us draw with confidence near to the throne of grace, that we may receive mercy and find grace to help in time of need." There are a bunch of other questions that we could ask about the book of Job. I don't think we have time. But I think when we look at the book of Job, what was God's point? You know, he never tells Job why. He never tells Job why. Why did this happen to me? Well, you know, it was Satan showed up and things happened, you know. God doesn't offer the explanation. And you know what? Once Job has seen God, he doesn't ask for it. And I think when each one of us sees God and we actually see him, we'll see a God who also suffers alongside of us. We'll see that God himself suffers. Why did God do this? To reveal himself to Job. Satan says, if you do this to Job, he will curse you to his face. Well, how do you curse someone to their face? You have to see their face. You have to be face to face with them. And you have to curse them. And Job says, no, I was wrong. You do have it under control, and I just have to trust you. And Job is redeemed, not just for himself, but his friends as well. It's interesting. He only gets his stuff back after he prays for his friends, after he makes sacrifices on their behalf. God redeems us, not simply to save ourselves, but so that we may join him in saving others. That we may join him in redeeming others from their wrong ideas about God, from our own wrong ideas about God. so that we can join with Corinthians, 2 Corinthians 5:14. The love of God controls us, because we have concluded this, that one has died for all, therefore we all have died and now live in Christ. Is there a closing song? Yeah, okay. For the benediction, I want to leave you with Ephesians chapter 3, verse 7 through 13. I became a servant of this gospel by the gift of God's grace given to me through the working of his power. Although I am less than one of the least of all the Lord's people, this grace was given to me to preach to the Gentiles the boundless riches of Christ and to make plain to everyone the administration of this mystery, which for ages past was kept hidden in God, who created all things. His intent was now, through the church, the manifold wisdom of God should be made known to the rulers and authorities in the heavenly realms, according to his eternal purpose that he accomplished in Jesus Christ our Lord. In him, and through faith in him, we may approach God with freedom and confidence. I ask you, therefore, not to be discouraged because of my sufferings for you, which are for your glory. May God bless you as you go out into the world this week.